annihilation, under threat of annihilation from this decree that went out by the hand of Haman, this enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai, Esther's relative, has called her to help the Jews, to speak to the king, to go to the king, even though for her, just marching into the king's courtyard uninvited could mean death for her. She, at the end, takes on that calling. Even though it may cost her her life, she's risking her life here to save the Jews from annihilation. And so, before she does so, she says to Mordecai, call the Jews to fast and pray for 3 days. And now the 3 days have ended. She has mustered her strength, and she goes to the king, as we see here in Esther chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on the royal throne inside the throne room, opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And Esther approached, touched the tip of the scepter, and the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even up to half of my kingdom. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Esther answered, my wish and my request is, if I had found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleased the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them tomorrow. I will do as the king has said. And Haman went out that day, joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home and sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions and with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. And Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. The idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. This is the word of the Lord. How often do you get to really brag about yourself? I mean, really boast, really show your pride of your accomplishments. There aren't many times where you really get to brag on yourself. One of the few places you do is creating your resume, going through a job interview. That single document of a resume is that one time where you're allowed, actually probably no, you're commanded to brag about yourself, to boast in your accomplishments. It was a strange time for me in this past year, applying to the church here, applying elsewhere, and just readying up my resume. And it's a very weird thing for a pastor to brag on himself. It's very awkward. It feels counterintuitive, right? But that's in many ways what resumes are. They're a list of your accomplishments, of your successes. It is often, when you look at your resume, it's like a ticket to the next thing that you're doing. You might not realize it, but what you are doing right now, be it school, be it work, whatever activity you're involved in, you might be living out the future line of your next resume. You're living through something that eventually you will write down as an accomplishment that you have. We don't often think about what we're doing right now because so often our eyes are focused on the next success. We don't often get too focused on the successes of today because we're just focused on the success the future. How do you think about success? How for you does it mean to be successful? What does a successful life look like? It's probably something a couple years down the road for you. And often do we think, I'm successful now. It's usually, I will be successful if and when. We're always thinking a mile down the road, trying to think what's next. But the difficulty of doing that when we're always thinking about the next great success, the next great accomplishment, the next line we get to put on our resume, is it turns your life into a treadmill, doesn't it? Where every foot is in front of the other, and this treadmill doesn't slow down. You're always thinking of the next accomplishment, and you can't get off. It is never ending, and that is just how our culture likes to think about success. You might be trapped on that treadmill right now. You might not realize it yet because you haven't quite reached that point that you think success is there. But you're not thinking of what God has brought you through at this point. We see this in ridiculous degree here today. We see two people really in the work of success, but they have very different responses. And their success here, Esther and Haman, looks very different. You see, with Haman, we see a man really at the height of his powers, the height of his influence, and all of a sudden, with all his success, he walks out joyless because he feels like he doesn't have it all. We see a woman, Esther, on this desperate mission, taking small, seemingly insignificant steps today. Two people make great accomplishments, Haman and Esther, but honestly, if we look at our passage, it looks like Haman's taken bigger steps than Esther is to their goal. Which really forces us in the end to ask, what is true godly success? What does it mean for us to be successful as Christians, successful employees or students wherever we are, but be successful in our faith as well? Well, we see in Haman this seductive allure of success that we must be aware of, the dangers of the allure of success. But Esther instead models this patient and slow success that is actually quite different and actually stands opposed to it. And it is when we understand that slow and patient success, we are seeing the way that God works success, as He works His salvation for us, what true godly success looks like. So as I already illustrated for us of the allure, the constant success, let's see the dangers of the allure of success that Haman shows us. You see, Haman, as we see in verses 9 to the end of the chapter, his success, his pride, has immense highs, high highs, but also crashing lows and crashing withdrawal. That's what his pride looks like. You see in verse 9 that his pride and his success and his accomplishments is riding high. He walks away with this big, dumb grin on his face from this private banquet he had with the king and queen. I mean, that is a huge accomplishment, right? Who else in the amazing, giant Persian Empire can make this statement? You can think of him already just thinking like, oh man, the next time I'm going to meet my friends, as I invite my friends to dinner tonight, I can just like casually name drop people now. Oh yes, Queen Esther said the funniest thing at dinner tonight, just name dropping that like it's nothing. It's a great time to be Haman. I mean, you can see him strutting through the King's Gate, probably giving finger guns at everyone he sees. And as he does that, by law, royal edict, they all have to fall down and honor him and pay homage to him. And that feels great, right? People are falling at his feet as he's walking by. And then he looks to his right and sees Mordecai sitting in the King's Gate. They lock eyes with each other. Mordecai doesn't move. Doesn't stand in honor. Doesn't fall in honor. They have this icy stare-off where Mordecai has communicated all of his derision and his disdain. And Haman, all of that pride and joy he had just vanishes as he sees Mordecai. It means nothing to him. The good vibes are gone, evaporated. Instead, all that's left is wrath, anger, muttering under his breath every curse in Persian that he knows against Mordecai. Pride can give you a pretty good high, but it also gives you a soul-crushing drop-off. For Haman, food loses its taste. The love for his family loses its twinkle. The prestige of his position just plummets. All these things that most would look at as a great source of pride and joy mean nothing to him. And notice what he says in verse 11. He lists his accomplishments, why every man in Persia would love to be him. But do you see how he orders things in verse 11? He says the splendor of his riches, his wealth, and then the number of his sons. His wealth is really what brings him his greatest joy. I mean, his family is secondary to that. He's like, oh yeah, and I've got, a bunch of beautiful kids. That's what comes next. And we can imagine, too, he probably has a number of daughters as well, but only really cares about the sons. That's probably the case for him as well. He looks at his sons as just a public mark of pride, of people who are carry on his legacy. That is what his sons are to him. Just people to continue on the name of Haman. That's it. But not even those things bring him joy, as he says in verse 13. All this is worth nothing to me as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. Think about that. In front of his wife, he's saying this. I don't care about my kids because Mordecai is still in his position. Daddy, do you love me? Well, son, I did. But then I saw Mordecai, and now you're kind of losing with me. What kind of love is that? That it shows how incomparable his love is compared to his hate. That really, for all his success, it means nothing unless everybody loves me. Unless I have everything. Unless everything is given to me. When you see how quickly that brings him down and how good he feels for a moment, how low he feels, it really shows you what that pride and success sound like a drug, don't they? They sound like a powerful narcotic. Makes you feel so good, but then once the chemical leaves your system, once it wears off, the withdrawal hits immediately and painfully. During my COVID quarantine, I was looking for a show to keep me entertained, and ironically, I settled on a show that depicts the horrors of American pharmaceuticals, which is like not the best thing to do when you're sick. I was watching the show Dope Sick, which it came out last fall and quite horrifically shows the events of the opioid epidemic of the last 20, 30 years. Began as a result of overprescription of Oxycontin, which is an opioid, highly addictive, but how lies were put out that it wouldn't be addictive. And it caused immense, intense addiction to all of its patients. And the emotional human heart of the show is the story of a small mining town in Virginia where a young coal miner falls deep, deep into opioid addiction. And it's tragic as you watch her parents try to help her through this destructive addiction as destruction and destruction keeps happening to her in how desperate she wants to find these drugs. And the most heart-wrenching, perhaps, part of the show is where she steals her mother's jewelry, her mother's wedding ring, to pawn it off so she can buy more drugs. It's saddening, it's tragic to see someone's brain chemistry altered so much that the good things, that those things that they would value and love and cherish in their own family turns into just another barrier to get their next fix, their next high. We can look at the dangers of drug addiction, but we need to be honest of the addiction that sin promises us and the allure of success. The highs, the good feelings that it feels to be successful and admired. But if we are just left to that desire, we'll crush anything, we'll steal from anyone that gets in our way so we can get that allure, that temptation of success. See what a danger it is to really live our lives for the next great accomplishment, for the next great resume line. We become addicts of success. And what that means is just as an addict stealing from her mother's jewelry, we also will turn towards wrath. We see that in Haman, turning towards violence and wrath in the creation of these gallows. You can maybe hear the laughter, the joking around at this dinner table, the pouring of more wine as the idea gets thrown out there. It's like, if Mordecai's bothering you so much, you're so great and powerful, why don't you just have him killed? Just construct these giant gallows, have him hung on it, and be done with him. And as they're laughing, the laughter kind of dies down. Haman says, yeah, that's exactly what I'll do. It should be pointed out that these gallows are going to be 75 feet high. It's taller than most trees, right? Just giant wood stake on which Mordecai will be hung. This exaggerated height, I think, reflects this exaggerated, over-the-top, unnecessary, relentless revenge he feels. He feels so comfortable in his position, he can ask anything to accomplish his revenge. Now, we don't lash out in creating gallows to hang our enemies on, but honestly, maybe it's because we don't have the power to do that. Haman has the power to get those gallows created. But instead, for us, when we feel those feelings of jealousy, of frustration, because that's at the end what's happening, jealousy. Haman is jealous for Mordecai's homage, jealous for Mordecai's respect. Perhaps for you, your jealousy in your life works with greater subtlety. The gossipy comment to someone else, the complaining, the passive-aggressive dig that you hope is torturing that person late at night, that you slipped right in to stab at them. No, you don't have the power to create these over-the-top gallows to hang others on, but you still may say in your heart, I cannot wait for their downfall. I can't wait for them to get what they deserve. You see, the allure for success often turns the allure of the destruction of others, who we don't like, who we have a problem with, who we want to see their downfall. We stake our heart and our desires for our own success, we will desire the violent destruction of all others. It becomes a lonely life if you want all for yourself. We see how destructive success can be. The personal, prideful success. But what is the other way, this slow success, this patient one, this frustratingly slow success? See, Haman has success here, doesn't he? He's successful in setting up his plot to kill the Jews, right? The decree has gone out. He will have the gallows made. He will be successful in that. But as we return now to Esther in the first part of our passage, do you think she is successful here? She is successful in saving the Jews from Haman, their enemy. For the past several weeks, we've been bringing up the central problem, this dilemma of Esther. The decree's gone out, and last week we saw that only Esther can save them. And today, are we going to see her save the Jews in this morning's sermon? No. Shortly, no. She doesn't accomplish that yet. All she does today is she asks for 2 banquets. Doesn't seem successful, does it? Well, it's a different question altogether. What is she doing here? She is patiently, slowly working towards this goal. First of all, we'll see all these ways that she is showing this patient, slow success, that she is indeed patient. The king is inviting her in. He extends the scepter to her, which means she's accepted. Do you realize what a relief that is for her? He could have extended the scepter, extended the sword to kill her, because she's broken the law, walking in here uninvited. But he does not extend his wrath to her. He gives her grace. Now's the time, right now she can save her people. Well, not so fast. I mean, the room is still filled with guards and attendants. To save her people means she's also exposing her identity as a Jew, so she can't quite do this yet. Remember when the king's authority was challenged in chapter 1? The queen was cast out. She can't just challenge his authority again. This is not a guy who's going to say, whoops, I was wrong. I don't think he knows those words in his language. The stakes of getting this order repealed is really high. There's no system, no method for a king to repeal his decree. There's a great deal of money that Ahasuerus has riding on this decree too. He'd be embarrassed if he repeals this. So we see in her patience, getting in the throne room, risking her life is kind of the easy part here, compared with getting the decree changed. So she knows not only must she be patient, but she's also persuasive to him. Now, when she asks for a second banquet, it feels like, is she losing her nerve? Why doesn't she bring up the issue here at the banquet now? If you know the story, at this next banquet, she'll raise the issue, but why has she not done it yet? Well, we saw last week she's only been here a month. And in that month, he's never requested to see her. So not only does she not have the access with the king, she actually doesn't have much of a relationship with him either. She does not have the relationship where she can, and first talking with him, bring up politics of the empire. She has to take her time. She has to persuade. She's building a case, building a relationship with him. where he will be forced to listen to her. She's persuasive. She's cunning here. The king and Haman don't know it yet. She's really boxing them in to where the king really has to listen to her. By continually offering, he's twice now offered to her up to half his kingdom. And she's just asking, no, just another banquet. No, just another banquet. Building the relational capital so that by tomorrow's banquet, the king will once again feel generous. And he will feel like he can't say no to what she says. In doing that, she's also winsome. She's appealing to the king's favor. She's friendly. She's polite. She's honorable to him. She is giving the honor that Haman so desperately wants for himself from everybody else. Putting on her best, her royal robes, following the protocol, not breaking the protocol aside from walking in there uninvited. Shows us how slowly, how patiently she is seeking the success of this plan to save the Jews. Being patient, persuasive, being winsome. It does tell us a little, I think, about how we can engage with others as well. I do think it shows us that often when preaching the gospel to others, it does mean playing the long game as well. How people see you is part of how they will hear the gospel message as well. So when God sends his messengers, he carries them through our mouths often, not just raining Bibles down from the heavens, but through the awkward act of preaching and speaking. So if we preach the message of how Christ changes us, we should show and live out to people what a changed life looks like, how desirable that really is. Someone who is willing to listen to them first, someone who understands, then brings forward truth. Someone who understands what it means to live sacrificial life, sacrificial love. That's what we can learn even from Esther here, that winsome, persuasive, and patient way of bringing the word of salvation to others. That is what Esther is doing here, risking her success, risking her comfort, so that others may be stopped from being killed. Haman instead is using his position to clear out anyone who diminishes his honor, kill anyone in the path of his success. So what is the greatest sign of Esther's patient success here in that verse 5? The king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." Again, who is master of the king's house? Well, he's just following whatever Esther says at this point. Esther is sending the king around on her errands now. He doesn't even notice it. What a deliciously ironic turn of events in chapter 1. Once again, the king is being ordered around by his king, by his queen. That is how influential Esther has become. That is the sign of God really working in her to this slow and patient salvation. So who really is more successful here? Who really has the will of the king in his hands? Well, it really isn't Haman, and certainly actually isn't Esther either. It's God in heaven who is directing the will of the king. You see, as we see in Esther modeling out this slow, patient success, that is also how God works his salvation in our lives. Understand this. If you are following after Christ, if you turn to Christ for hope and salvation, then for you, success has become redefined, has a new definition. That all of a sudden now, success is not defined by advancement, by accomplishment. Success for you is defined by sacrifice. And honestly, that should make no sense to you. It should make no sense to the world. That God's success is so counterintuitive to the way the world thinks. See, every week we come together, we sing the praise of the success, the victory of God for what he's done, his success. But what does God's success look like for you? This all-powerful, almighty King of the universe. And a people that rebel against him. His own creation that mock him, blaspheme against him. He could, in his power, just keep destroying the world over and over again, hitting the reset button because of sin. He doesn't do that. He's able to, he doesn't. Instead, our God works patiently. He works with us, his creation. Enters a covenant relationship with us, even though we're covenant breakers. Rebels who mock him, who live as if he doesn't exist. And instead, God in his covenant relationship with us spends years changing us, sending his Son to die for us. God's success is not just for success for himself, but his mission is to change, to redeem, to declare righteous, not start from scratch. Our God is great not simply because he's able to create and destroy, but our God is great because he redeems what has been fallen away from him in sin, and he recreates. So what does godly success mean for you? Godly success is you're striving towards redemption, towards that recreation in the image of his Son. That slow, patient, persuasive work that the Spirit is working in you in sanctification. Your success is not the wealth you have then. Your success is not the promotions you've received, how perfect your family appears. Instead, success is, am I using my ransom life to speak of salvation? I encourage you today, find joy in Christ. Don't stake your joy in the success of your career and the honor others give you. It's a dangerous game to think that you can be happy as long as you're successful. Because that allure of success will take many different forms. I want to be seen as a successful student. I was a successful son or daughter. I want my spouse to think I'm successful at my job. I was talking with a man a couple months ago who was talking about how much he thinks about what his young son thinks about his work. Does he look at my work and see a father that he's proud of, who admires in his work and what he does? I want my son to think highly of me. It's a good thing to desire. That pride from your son, your daughter. That can be a difficult chase to begin, because if you are staking that, are you hoping that they see your promotions or wealth? Or are you hoping that they see in your work a patient love, a slow life of faithfully loving Christ and showing other the love of Christ? That if we want the pride and honor from other people, we should want them to be admiring the love of Christ that is lived out in us. This joy and clumsy road of following Christ. So I ask you, are you tired of trying to strive for success? If not, you soon will be. Feeling like there just isn't an end. You want your life to have meaning and purpose, to be able to get to the end and know that you've done enough. It's only by faith in Christ and following with him that you can hear, well done, good and faithful servant, because it's his work that brought success. It's his perfect life that you live in. Haman's trying to build his resume. But Esther was living like this day would be her last. Instead, we live as our life is modeled after Christ and his work. A good friend mentioned to me an article many years ago in the New York Times by David Brooks called The Moral Bucket List, in which he describes these two virtues, resume virtues and eulogy virtues. And my friend mentioned this to me because about a month ago, our high school guidance counselor passed away. And this man was more than just a guidance counselor. He was a discipler to my whole school, spending time patiently with each student, showing the love of Christ to them, showing Christ's work in his life, and calling them to that kind of life. It was at this funeral that I attended a month ago that we really continued to hear how he lived his life. And it was a strange feeling that I hadn't quite felt at a funeral before, which is a weird sense of envy. Envy at another person's funeral. Envy at someone's eulogy. Really, because I heard as people talked about how they knew Christ in his life, and I thought, will people say the same at mine? I don't know if people will speak about me the way they speak of him. Am I living a life that everyone sees and knows Christ? Eulogy envy was real for me that day. People made it clear that as they knew Dave, they knew Jesus better. That's what eulogy virtues are. That's what my friend mentioned this article, which is really from more of a kind of moralistic perspective, that if you live and do good things and cultivate eulogy virtues, that's better than just cultivating resume virtues, is the point there. But what that means for us as Christians is, what are eulogy virtues for us? It's not that, they gave their money to the poor. It's not just that, they really were good at calling me up on my birthday. eulogy virtues that we want to cultivate in our life. A successful funeral for us is people who spend the whole time talking about Christ. Spend the whole time talking about how closely they knew Jesus better and his work. Gives you perspective, doesn't it? I mean, I could desire to be famous. I could be desired to be quoted for all my wisdom I've said, or write books, or have a Wikipedia page with my name on it. But what good is that if when I'm dead and gone, people are not talking about Jesus? That's what true virtue is. That's a stumbling, difficult road. Continue in our life to seek the success of Christ to be proclaimed in everything we do. Our own resume virtues are not going to be enough to satisfy us. We should be satisfied in what God is satisfied in us, the perfect worth of Christ. So we should be careful not to take the gospel for granted, right? That is, don't confuse salvation with being a successful Christian, of people who are good and honorable in their community. Because we're not accepted by God because we have a good Christian resume. Because we rose through the ranks of the church. God doesn't look at your resume and say, here's the perfect Christian who did all they could to overcome sin, really get where they are. Your resume is Christ's resume. That's what he sees. How dare we approach the royal throne of God? Just as Esther feared approaching the king, how dare we approach God's throne? We are sinful. How can we? We come to this table today not trying to put on our best royal robes, but by putting on Christ's robes. We come to this table today because we've been washed in the blood of Christ. God finds favor in us because of faith in Jesus Christ, his Son. His scepter is extended to you, inviting you to this table if you have been washed in the blood of Christ, turned in faith to him, joining to his church together as we feast in faith together. We are welcomed at this feast today because of his success, his victory. If you have not known yet that success of Christ, you can stay seated as the rest of us, row by row, come forward. We'll be coming forward down this aisle and then turning out that way to return to your seats. I'll have before you the cup and the cracker, and saying to each of you as you come, the body and the blood of Christ, which is for you. So we hear today that on the night which Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, and after giving thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Eat in remembrance of me." And after the supper, after giving thanks, he took the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant of my blood for remission of sins. Drink from it, all of you." So Christians, as often as you eat this bread and you drink this cup, you are proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes again. Let's come down row by row and feast on this success of our Savior. Oh Lord, would you use these simple elements of cracker and juice as a way of